Speakers, if you guys could put on your cameras. We are going to ask one question. It's going to get asked to each of the presenters. After the presenters have the ability to answer the question, we will open it up to you guys, the attendees. See if you have any comments on that particular question. We will allow the panelists to then have a chance to respond, and we're going to highly encourage you to raise your hands if you would like to speak or ask a question, and also put a Q&A in the Q&A after the first question.
All right. First question for everybody. How can you assess if enrichment for birds is causing stress or providing enrichment?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's so important to be able to tell the difference. So it depends on your species. You're going to be looking for telltale signs of stress, which will be species dependent, but a few things that you can look for across the board in general. Again, big, broad, general statements here. Hiding, moving away from, fight, flight, or freeze response. So moving away from that object or the item, hiding more than usual, any sort of unusual behaviors, trying to get away. And then more subtly, I would look for slicked down feathers. Birds tend to pull their feathers down tight against their bodies when they're nervous. And then what I call eye darting, which is that looking up and around and away as though they're looking for a place to get to. So those are all things that I would think of as actively causing stress or active signs of stress in a bird. Now, if an item is just sitting in the enclosure, for example, and the bird seems to be ignoring it completely, and you're asking yourself the question, is the bird stressed or just ignoring it? Again, I'd look at the body posture. If you see loose feathers and the bird's just sitting there, maybe a foot tucked and looking around, I wouldn't consider that stressful, but perhaps the animal doesn't understand that that is something that has value to him or her. And so that's an opportunity that you may want to use to train the animal towards that enrichment item. I hope I answered the question there. Anybody have anything to add?
I don't have
Go ahead, Madison.
I don't have the fancy hand raising button, so I'm just going to use my actual hand. Yeah, one thing I was thinking of too is that also like if you see a lot of aggression towards the enrichment item instead, like a really high arousal response, and that the bird like is not engaging in any other normal behaviors because it's only focused on an aggressive response to the enrichment, I would say that that could also lead towards what I would call negative stress.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Let me ask another question. What resources or training would you recommend for anyone interested in learning more about how to design, implement, and assess enrichment in birds? Any takers?
Oh, can you can you hear me?
Go right ahead. Yes, go right ahead, Cody.
Yeah. Well, I can I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I'm gonna try to mute my.
We hear you fine.
Okay. Well, I can tell you in about after this symposium, when we have our videos up, there's going to be a great couple of resources up there that people are going to be able to watch. So that's one. But kidding aside, I think a lot of the presenters showed that there's some great websites that you can get on, like listservs that people have put out there. It's all about using your imagination, mixing that what's normal, natural behavior, mixing what's the material, and then partnering those together and let that creativity blossom. And there's pictures out there, and that's what you need to use.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Oh, Danielle.
Yeah, my one related to birds. Some really cool enrichment ideas that I found was, like something that someone over here made for a lion. And I was like, oh, I can make that on like a tiny scale and use it for birds. So I would say just don't limit yourself to just searching for bird enrichment, because there's lots of great ideas out there that originated with mammals that you could kind of just switch over and use for your birds.
Okay, thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Danielle. You can always repurpose or tweak ideas that are already out there. And there are a lot of Facebook groups that are dedicated to enrichment. Zoo Creepers and is just the first one that pops in my mind, but there are actually a lot of Facebook groups that you could join into. That's always buyer beware though, and vet those things on in your situation with your animals before you implement them. But if you're looking for inspiration, it's a great place to go. And then I would also recommend just getting to know the natural history of the animals. If you can ask yourself, what does this animal do in the wild, and how might I be able to get them to do that in human care? And then think outside the box. I think all of those are ways to learn.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Okay,
Okay, we again want to encourage participation. So if any attendees have any questions they'd like to have or ask, you should have a hand raising option now where you can raise your hand and ask live. We do have a question that came in through the Q&A. So panelists, for birds with severe neophobia that are not able to be handled or you cannot get close safely, what would it be considered something to have a vet sign off on that new enrichment would be offered less frequently?
So if this is, I'll take a crack at it a little bit. If this is something new, a new enrichment device that, a bird that's really, you think is going to react negatively, something new. It's, a lot of the speakers talked about having really slow steps. We really don't want to traumatize a bird, especially we know that has a history of having that fearful response. And so what I would do is take the object that if you're trying to, have that normal natural behavior, if that's something that you want to try, have that discussion with the attending vet, right? That'd be saying, hey, let's start off this conversation, have that plan forward and say, hey, it may take months or even years, who knows, okay? Depending on, what's the bird's history and the behaviors going on. But it doesn't even have to even start in the enclosure. It will start outside the enclosure. The bird can see it outside and get it familiar with it and then see how that response is. And it's all about small increment steps. And then slowly bring it into the enclosure if you see positive, steps. And if you don't, though, that's when you know to take a step back and pause.
okay, thank you, Cody. Danielle, I think you first.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest the same thing with like starting with something visual, like really far away. But I think when it boils down to it, you're thinking about the welfare and what's best for that particular bird. Maybe it's not enriching it 5 days a week like you are with your other birds. So it is, I think, worth having a discussion with your team to start with things far away. And maybe we're not enriching it quite. But what is the best thing for that bird?
Okay, thank you. Melissa?
I think this is the perfect opportunity to talk about what else is enrichment besides putting something in the enclosure that the animal is going to actually interact with, and the putting it in the enclosure is going to cause problems. I would want to start with an animal that is that fearful or displaying those kinds of fear behaviors, starting with training sessions. So, and I would want to start those training sessions with the goal of getting human interaction being a more positive thing? How can we work towards just having a person in your area? And then at the second thing I would be thinking about is looking at what natural sorts of things can we be eliciting that don't require something that might be scary, an item that might be scary to the animal. So looking at natural behaviors like bath pans and things like that are far less likely in most cases to elicit a fear response. Yeah, and then training. So thinking about enrichment differently, it's not necessarily that thing that you're giving them, but it's trying to elicit some natural behaviors.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
I was going to say the same thing too, that, you know, especially if you're working with a species that's part of a conservation breeding program and you're wanting that animal to display those behaviors, maybe evaluating what the natural, like Melissa just said, evaluating the natural history and then just doing slow steps and just shaping your enrichment plan around that. I mean, when we were working with, or when I worked at a previous institution with Atwater's prairie chicken with a grouse, you can't give it something that's vibrant or any sort of like toy because it's not going to react well to it. So, you know, looking at things like, can you grow things to give it, or different types of food enrichment or something like that. It's not necessarily something that scares it, but something that just enhances its experience.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Sorry, I don't know where my hand raising button is either. So, um, yeah, I kind of agree with what everybody said, but I think another aspect of that would to be talk about record keeping. So, if you're approaching an animal that has had experience with a certain item or a certain enrichment program and it hasn't worked in the past, accurate record keeping is good for people who are going to be following you in those routines or with that animal. So it's very important to write stuff down. I think Adam Savage said the difference between science and screwing around is writing it down. You know, so keeping those records are extremely important. Just from a personal experience, I've worked with certain pelicans before who were terrified of everything, and keepers who followed me after a pumpkin fiasco knew not to give them pumpkins anymore because we kept those accurate records, and that's very important for learning what works and what doesn't.
Okay. Anyone else have a comment?
Okay. Next question. Other than natural trees and branches, what other things do you use for perching? Madison?
I have had a lot of success with like ship rope, like really large diameter, like sisal rope. And we buy these giant reels of it, and it's really heavy, and we can wrap it around like support poles of the exhibit or like welded rings to poles, and we use like plumber's tape or hose tape to tighten it down and keep it secure. And I found it really successful with a lot of species. And I also like grapevine, and they make fake grapevine for primates, which is really accessible and easy to get for a lot of facilities to buy a big like that fake grapevine that lasts longer. So I've had a lot of success with those items, and like for long stringing or draping type of perching that's a little bit more dynamic than like static or like really tough hardwood.
Ian?
Thank you. I don't know where my hand is either. On the smaller scale with some of the birds that aren't super destructive to perching, look to the herp folks because there's some really nice herp perching out there that's flexible and has some memory to it. But, you know, to talk a little bit of what Madison said about the vines, you know, your grapevine resources are great. And then there are some invasive species, at least here in the Northeast, that are really great, not only for perching, but also for getting out of the environment.
Thank you. Melissa?
For raptors and a lot of other species, I've used a variety of surfaces that I've covered in a turf material. So not for parrots or birds who tend to chew things up, but for all sorts of other birds. Used matting, both longleaf astroturf and more of a stadium astroturf covering perches. Use the sisal rope, as Madison said, wrapped around surfaces. So you can get something that's simple and hardy, like even a round piece of PVC pipe or a piece of handrail that you buy at Lowe's or some hardware store, and just cover it with a surface that is more foot friendly than this smooth wood surface or smooth PVC surface. Had a lot of great luck with that. And we loved those fake rocks that you buy for your yard and put in your yard to cover up some unsightly grate or something. You can get different sizes and shapes, and you can use them either bare as is or put turf on top of those by drilling holes through the plastic.
Okay, thank you. This question says, do you have a lot of problems with predators raising waterfowl, especially with raccoons and foxes? Alex?
I would say you definitely could have major problems with fox and raccoons when you raise waterfowl. I'll go back to Ian's previous presentation on structure building, and a key point would be site barriers around the perimeter. At our facility, we utilize a 3-foot site barrier around the whole exterior of our perimeter, just so what's outside can't see what's inside. But we do take other measures as well, like burying wire beneath the surface, and so there can be no trenching. But we do also do some prevention with electric hot wire going around the perimeter, just so we keep predators away from our aviaries.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Madison?
We have actually had a couple of raccoons at Oakland Zoo start to learn how to open up like corners of our aviaries. They climb up the poles and then they start like peeling apart the mesh. And so one thing that's been really helpful for us is like recognizing any of the like seams or edges or the corners of the exhibits get reinforced with extra mesh or larger gauge mesh, like tougher gauge. So it's just a thicker mesh that it's harder for the raccoons to physically peel open and open like holes into the aviaries.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, we kind of had a similar problem, not for predation, but raccoons getting on top of our aviary and carrying things like Sarco to our birds by their droppings. What we did, we actually lined it with about 1.5 to 2 feet of plexiglass around the top. So as they got that far up the mesh, they couldn't climb anymore because they were sliding down on the plexiglass. And that was a good way to prevent them from getting up on top of the roof of the aviaries above that. So that may be something as well if you're having them pull apart areas, things that they can't climb on or claw up, like the mesh. A piece of plexiglass works just great for that.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Okay, next question. I would love to train animals to willingly participate in programming, but currently many of the birds at my facility have been there for decades and were never trained to accept food on glove. Would you suggest starting training all of our birds to willingly participate moving forward, or focus our attention on training for incoming birds and maintain as much comfort as possible while maintaining the status quo for our senior birds?
Melissa?
That is an excellent question, and whoever you are not alone in dealing with this question. This is the question that many centers and organizations are coming up against right now, because we're seeing more and more operant conditioning, positive reinforcement trainers are coming on the scene. There's more known now about behavior science, much less than when even I got into the field in the 80s and 90s. There's so much more information. And so the way that birds or animals were trained even 20, 30 years ago is very different than the way it's done now. So how to answer that question for you, it's going to be a cost benefit analysis, depending on what your organization needs are and whether those birds can be maintained with good welfare without going through a training process. I would say it's very situational. It's going to depend on how your setup is and what kind of purpose or job those birds have in their situation, right? So if they're going to be doing educational programs and you're going to have to go into their enclosure and basically grab them out and force them to go to a program, I would say that's not good welfare for those animals. And in my opinion, you'd be better off to initiate a training program for those animals and see if you can improve their welfare. If, however, you have the opportunity to retire those birds and have them live out their lives in a situation where they don't have to be going into education programs, then I would say maybe there's a benefit to leaving them in the situation that they are and focusing towards the newer incoming birds. This is something that I've consulted with a lot, and if you wanted to talk more about it, please message me. I'd be happy to offer what I can.
Okay. Any other comments?
Okay, next question. When it comes to providing enrichment for birds who are not meant to be breeding, such as companion birds, how do you draw the line between inadvertently encouraging reproductive behaviors and providing a natural outlet for those behaviors that are going to happen anyways? Asking specifically regarding nesting materials with the concern that providing no nesting materials might result in worse behaviors like self-mutilation.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
To me, it really depends on the species and what your overall goal is. If it's not only self-mutilation, but it can also be egg binding. There's some bird species that will cycle whether they have a nest box or not. So provide them that comfort to have that natural function is good. It can be. When I worked with a parrot breeding facility that had more breeding parrots, what we found was if we didn't provide them with a nest box, they would self-mutilate, or we would have a problem with a female who would become egg bound. So I think you should provide them with a nest box, with the caveat of knowing their seasonality. And if there's aggression surrounding that nest box, then maybe it needs to go away, or maybe that animal needs to be separated from the group. I think it's really dependent on the individual and the species.
Okay, anyone else?
Okay, next question. For animals that typically capture and ingest live prey, if there are no means of providing live prey to them as a method of food enrichment, if or when this is done for birds in captivity or in zoos, aviaries, or public education, are there concerns raised from visitors with regards to the prey, and how are those dealt with?
Yeah, go ahead, Madison.
So with the aviaries that I work with at Oakland, we give live insects to our birds daily, multiple times a day. It's a really highly valued diet item for them. We use it for training. We use a lot superworms, crickets. A lot of the times when it comes to insects, I don't really have a lot of guests who have an emotional reaction to live insects being eaten. We also will sometimes give live feeder fish to some of our, like our hammerkop and our storks. And that is less visible to the public. So again, sometimes we don't get so many comments, but one thing that I've really enjoyed doing that was very well received was I did an educational program where I created a race with of a competition between the guests. It was a Boy Scout group and the birds I was feeding the mealworms to, and it was who can eat the mealworms faster, the kids or the birds. And so we would time it, and I'd throw the mealworms, and then the birds would all just get really excited about it. And so it was really engaging, and it was, kind of building that empathy with that competition between the kids and the birds. And at the end, I had all of the kids said, "We want to eat a mealworm." And I said, "Well, your parents are here, and if they agree, these are fit for human consumption, so go ahead." And they all did. And then I had a lot of half chewed up mealworms spit out on the ground. So I maybe don't recommend that end part of it, but it was a really fun way to get people engaged with being okay with eating like live prey.
Okay, thank you. Melissa?
Madison, I love that. That's fabulous. We also use some live insects and haven't had any sort of negative feedback from our guests in general. And in my experience in working with raptors, we typically do not, in my history, have not used live prey as an enrichment item for a couple of reasons. One of them is pragmatic. It's much easier to keep food in the freezer and thaw it than it is to maintain the live prey. Excuse me, and also there's the concern about live prey in a confined space actually turning around and biting the foot or leg of the raptor in this case. So generally, I would not recommend that. And then, of course, you have the visitor concerns as well. I think there are other things you can do for raptors in human care besides live prey, and that may be the one thing that you have to draw the line on. An exception would be maybe as enrichment, or definitely as enrichment for wildlife rehabilitators, for birds who are being rehabilitated. They may actually need that live prey in order to train on. So some thoughts there.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
So this may not fully answer the question, not that we have all the answers, but just so that whoever asked it and anybody else listening understands that it's a real concern amongst the community. In fact, the most recent welfare summit that I just attended, we spoke about live prey and their care and their welfare in animal care institutions, whether it be crickets, mealworms, mice, rats, quail, things like that, or in the case of some things like kingfishers that eat animals. We did speak at length about it, and it is a concern, and not just us. There were people from Europe and Australian zoos there as well too, who actually have similar concerns. And so it is talked about in the community, and it is something that we're looking at a welfare standpoint for things, everything from insects on up as far as live prey goes.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Again, if you have a question, put it in the question box and we'll make sure we get to it. We have some time. And also, for those listening, if you raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask your question live as well.
Okay, for the next question. For birds that are not trusting of the hand or new items, even new food presented, what are the best steps you find their favorite treat without scaring them or discouraging their courage? Don't all jump in at one time.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
This is kind of similar to a question that was just asked earlier, and I think the answer, and it was a very good answer, was just the small steps. Whatever it may be, whatever item that is high value to that animal. If that's something you want to work with, that's great, but obviously you don't want to scare them off of it. But just, I stress patience with all my staff, is that, these things, they take time. We all have a goal. We want to get to it. We're not going to get to it right away. So, again, species dependent, your situation, your facility is all going to be dramatically different from everybody else in here. So there's not one solid answer, but there is an approach to it, and that is patience, small steps, and doing your research, making sure that you have all the information available to you before you approach the situation. Having a good game plan, and an end game are great ways to approach any of these situations. But it's something that they're scared of. There's no one answer to it. It's going to take some time and work with that individual itself.
Okay, thank you. Madison, I think you were up first.
We've done quite a few like food preference tests with some really shy birds at Oakland. Again, more intern projects, intern led. So a lot of times what we've done is we've created a feeding station with like a tray, and we've put different types of food on, and we've either stepped and observed from outside the exhibit or stepped really far back to give those shy animals the ability to come down and engage in that preference test. And then record answers, from outside, or putting up a camera and completely leaving the entire area and then looking at the footage later to see what was consumed. And also with a lot of shy birds, I have fed with anything other than my hands. So I really like soup ladles. And that are like just an extension of your arm. And again, that, there is descents for a shy bird or a nervous bird or a neophobic bird to engage with that. But soup ladles have worked really well, or even just deli cups, being able to hold up something. I just did a preference test with our macaws and in order to protect both my fingers and give them clear options, just held everything up in deli cups that they could take choices from. So feeding in anything other than your hand, an extension of your arm, a soup ladle, a spoon, a cup, a tray, has been really successful for some of our scared birds.
Okay, thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, Madison, I love that. The deli cup idea, we've used that a lot too. And hemostats we've used for, again, making your hand longer than it is. I think all of those are useful. And I like to echo what Mike said too about the shaping the behavior and taking small steps. But if you have this kind of situation, I would encourage you to learn a little bit more about operant conditioning training. Either get someone to give you a hand or get some training yourself so that you can learn how to apply it, because it's a classic opportunity for counter conditioning and for helping that animal to learn and to grow and become a more confident animal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question is, what are your thoughts on concrete epoxy wrap purchase for raptors or any birds? There's also a very similar question that wants to know about safe adhesives for raptors, so we'll wrap them together.
Go ahead, Melissa.
Felt like raptors might have been directed a little bit towards me on that one. I'm not familiar with the epoxy resin sort of perching that specifically that you may be talking about. When I go to evaluate a perch for raptors to use, I look at how hardy is it, and then the size and the shape. The main thing I don't want is a totally smooth perch, but I also don't want something that's got sharp points. Raptor feet are very sensitive to being to injury. Once they're injured, they're very difficult to heal. They can get infected and get a bumblefoot sort of infection. So protecting their feet and making sure you have the right size especially is critical, and providing a variety of perch sizes. As far as epoxies that are safe to use, I'm afraid I'm outside of my depth on that. Maybe someone else can offer some thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Madison.
Whenever I'm looking at epoxies or resins or coatings, I look to the aquarium community. Anything that is listed as safe for fish or safe underwater tends to be pretty safe for birds, and will stand up to a cleaning routine and a care and a maintenance routine of whatever item is built. So I look to our fish friends for some safety recommendations for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question. What are some feeder designs that can minimize birds scooping or knocking food onto the ground where it can be contaminated?
Go right ahead, Madison.
Yeah, in the exhibits that I work with, one of our major challenges is pest control. A lot of times in facilities, wild animals know that it's good to get into exhibits because it's a good place to be and good resources. And so food exclusion is big for us, is making sure that that food doesn't get to the ground, not just so that it gets contaminated, but so that it doesn't attract pests. So a lot of our passerine food is fed on pole, like tray holders. So it's a pole that's concreted into the ground, and it is a tray, and it holds a tray, a diet tray. And then even so, we found that when some of the heavier bodied birds, like the pigeons and the doves, would land on the trays, they'd land heavy and they'd spew food, they'd scatter stuff. And so what we did is we just cut some mesh to add to on top of the food for the tray, to give some grip to that the tray, so that when the birds landed, they weren't slipping and sliding on the metal and throwing food everywhere. I can't really stop the red-bellied parrot from throwing some of her food items to the ground, because that's very natural behavior for her. But adding grip, elevating food, suspending food, and making it easier for birds to land on it higher has been really successful for us, so that they're not landing on the lip of a bowl and tipping it over, or like landing and scattering stuff.
Okay, thank you. Danielle?
Yeah, similar to what Madison was saying, giving the bird something to land on if you have an elevated feeder. I've wrapped the top of feeders in like line or some perching, just so that they have a spot that they can grip on that's not your bowl. That's what's going to go. And then for stuff that's on the ground, you have some big pigeons too that come into really annoying. So finding a larger, heavier bowl that you can put your feedable into. Like I've seen some really heavy like concrete bowls or really big dog bowls that they can kind of stand on the edge of it and not flip your bowl if you have to use like a small pan or something inside of it, but something heavy that they can kind of step on and not flip it over.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Oh, go ahead, Ian.
As Danielle mentioned, that double bowl method works really well. The one thing we've also done with that is include water in that outer bowl to prevent things like ants from getting into the inner bowl. But creating that double bowl system, or using something like a boot tray to put your feeder on, so you can keep up with the cleanliness there for those messy feeders and birds that come in a little hard to the feeders, can really help minimize that.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? All right.
Mike.
Oh, is Mike there? Mike?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, those are all great ideas, and you see them a lot in a lot of aviaries with mixed species. Not knowing the questioner's facility or where they're at, what birds they're dealing with. If your concern is with food falling to the ground, becoming contaminated, it might be something to look at the ground itself. Is this just, a kind of a anthropomorphic, oh, food fell on the floor, it's no good. But if you have ground foragers, you have birds that are going to be picking up food off the ground, and you have a concern with contamination, I think you have a larger concern with, the contaminated ground than food just falling out of a dish. And I don't know if that is, again, just, you saying, oh, I don't like to eat food off the ground, but a lot of birds will have no problem doing that and can ingest it. So if that is a concern, it may be something else to look at in that sense, as far as, what contaminants you're worried about on the ground in your aviary or facility that you have.
Okay, thank you. And anyone else?
Yeah, and another option I've seen other facilities do is just break up the meals. I mean, birds are not necessarily meant to have a giant meal ready for them, but have small meals throughout the day. So I've seen a lot of success where what they'll do is just have, morning, evening, in lunchtime feedings, and they'll have a lot less waste. just have smaller meals break up too. That may be one suggestion.
Okay, thanks, Cody. Do have a question here. Mr. Gereg pointed out earlier today that knowing a bird species' natural history and provided several resources, eBird and Birds of the World. Are there any resources? Okay, I guess it's worded around. Are there any resources that would that you would recommend to better understand a species' natural behavior for developing a species-specific or a species-appropriate enrichment plan? Yeah, go right ahead, Mike.
So yeah, I guess somebody had mentioned eBird and Cornell. Those are great resources. There's an ornithological society that is across the globe basically, and they publish a lot of different articles based on new behaviors or new observations. So looking into maybe local, state, and then country or even global ornithological societies. Audubon Society, not affiliated with the zoo, is another great resource for a lot of information about natural birds here in the U.S. So depending on what country you're in, looking up those resources or those societies that are active in publications or active in research are another great way to find out natural behaviors, and any kind of science publications that may not be necessarily geared towards ornithology, but will publish other ornithological papers or research are a great way to do it. So it may be a lot of digging depending on where you live, but a lot of that is available online if you look hard enough. But yeah, those ornithological societies are a great resource.
Okay, thank you. Ian?
It's a little more clunky, and I didn't mention it in my talk, but Google Scholar can be your friend in those situations. You have to do a little more digging, but there's often quite a few free and accessible resources there as far as journal articles and observations of wild birds that can be really helpful. It's going to take a little more time.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments?
Madison?
I usually start with the Avian Scientific Advisory Group. They have a website that's divided by taxa, and they will make fact sheets, and they're usually like 2-page fact sheets with broad information, but they have a lot of information about temperature requirements, some behavior, some recommendations for like compatible species, or if the species is known for not getting along well or being aggressive towards any other species. And so I usually like to start there, and then I look at their citations, and then I go for a deeper dive.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Okay. Well, if everyone could give a reaction for the awesome job our panelists did on today's panel. Thank you very much, panelists, for your presentations today, as well as being on the panel. We appreciate your time.